I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler on this week's episode. We'll start off with a big win over Florida State to cap off really a crazy finish down the stretch here. And then we'll talk about recruiting. We'll go one by one. For those of you who don't follow recruiting super close, here's your intro to the new Gators. And for those of you who do follow recruiting, we'll give our little thoughts on a couple little thoughts on each player, and we'll keep it moving because it's inflated over the last few weeks here. The recruiting class is not doing so hot for some time. Billy Napier starts winning some football games, a little more stability. All of a sudden, you got some buyout money sitting around, and the Gators can put together a pretty nice class down the stretch compared to what we were looking at. Maybe not where we want to be, but definitely significantly improved from where we were just a short time ago. Let's start with Florida State, though. The Gators go into Tallahassee and win 31-11 on Ron Zook Field. Will 99 rushing yards on 44 attempts for the Florida State Seminoles. That really speaks to their season. We looked at the numbers last week. We said this should be a blowout. Honestly, if the Gators were cooking and doing what they should have been doing overall, and we are where we should be as a program, this is probably a 51-11 game. But some of those mistakes, they keep you back a little bit. It's a slow start in the first half, and Florida goes into the locker room. Really, just they put up a touchdown drive there later in the second quarter, and they got it rolling for a good bit there. But a lot of sloppiness from Florida State, in addition to that 2.3 yards per rush. Florida State had 5 turnovers on the night, all fumbles. All fumbles. The Seminoles looked every bit of the 2-10 roster they are, and the game ends with a solid flag plant, multiple plants at midfield, and an upset Mike Norvell. I'm not sure if he was more upset about finishing 2-10 and winning one home game all season, or if he was actually upset about the flags at midfield.
I mean, I think, look, Florida State is incompetent this year. That's really, to me, the take-home message because Florida wasn't very good. I thought DJ Lagway had his worst game of the year. I don't think that's debatable. I mean, I guess you could say the second half against Tennessee was as bad as what he was against Florida State. But so there's a couple things there. One is it was his worst game of the year so far, but he still threw 2 touchdown passes, still had a QB rating up around 140. So, we're grading him on a curve, or at least I'm grading him on a curve, no longer as a true freshman. I'm grading him on a curve as can he win Florida a championship? And this was one of those where you're like, okay, there's a lot to learn coming out of this. And in some ways, maybe that's good, right? Heading into the bowl practices, heading into the bowl game, heading into next season. Now Florida gets a win, but has a lot of teaching tape, especially on the offensive side of the ball. And Lagway seems like a humble kid who wants to learn anyway, but it always helps when you're sitting there going, okay, I know I can play better than that. And you go into film study that way rather than like let's say we'd come in off the Kentucky game. Like if this game had been earlier in the year and then that Kentucky game where he goes out and throws for like 18 yards to throw and hits every single deep pass right on the dot, maybe you have a different feeling heading into the bowl season. So this is probably good. I mean, look, Florida State's fumbles set up punts and took away points, or set up points and took away points from them. The first fumble sets up Florida 14 yards from the end zone. The I think third or fourth fumble was right as they were going in to make it 17-10, conceivably there in the second half. Instead, they fumble it. A few plays later, Montrell Johnson hits a 65-yard run. Florida's up 24-3, and the game's over. I mean, the minute he hit that, we go, oh, that's ball game, right? Now that is a Napier hallmark, right? Is to sort of get up by 3 touchdowns and then kind of sit on it. I was a little bit surprised actually that they threw for the touchdown there in the fourth quarter to make it 31. I kind of expected them to kind of sit on the ball and run it and kick a field goal and then I wouldn't have covered and all all those different sorts of things. Instead they threw it. So there was a little bit of aggression there, but yeah, I mean, overall, this is one of those where Florida had played 4 straight emotional games when you really think about it, right? They had played the Georgia game where they went in there, I think, thinking they could win. I think after Lagway hit the laser to Mizell, they really thought they could win when they were up 10-3. Then Lagway goes down with an injury, all the air goes out of it, but they still fought like crazy and end up, lost by 2 touchdowns, but that was a closer game than 2 touchdowns. I think most people would agree. Then sort of had the hangover of the Lagway injury injury traveling to Texas and just get completely destroyed. And obviously, the noise around the program at that point was probably at the peak that it was all year. And then go out and have two emotional home wins against LSU and Ole Miss. The emotion on Billy Napier's face, I'm sure, after that Ole Miss game was shared by the team. So to come out in this game against a team that is inferior, it did kind of feel like a cat. Like my old cat used to like bring me the bird, and the bird wasn't dead, but the bird didn't have any feathers left and like couldn't do anything. But the cat wouldn't actually kill the bird. And that's kind of what it felt like with Florida and Florida State. Like Florida could have done anything they wanted with Florida State in this game. If Florida State had made it 17-10 without fumbling it, I have zero doubt that Florida would have eventually focused and driven them off the field. But it felt like that Montrell Johnson drive was basically them going, all right, like, it's time to finally step on your throat. And that is something they're going to have to develop, right? They're going to have to develop a killer instinct to be able to take out teams like Florida State because every once in a while, I mean, we saw it with Georgia Tech, right? Georgia Tech's an inferior team, but Georgia allowed them to hang around, and all of a sudden, all of a sudden, that one's a tight game. We saw it with Ohio State and Michigan. We saw it with Clemson and South Carolina. Like, now granted, those are way better teams than Florida State was this year, but Notre Dame, Northern Illinois is maybe a good example, right? When you allow an inferior team to hang around, weird stuff can happen. And so Florida, thankfully, didn't allow any of that to happen, took advantage of the turnovers that Florida State gave them. And the defense was running havoc all night. I mean, I think their havoc rate was like 34% for the game. So when a third of the plays end up in a tackle for loss, a sack, an interception, or a turnover, you're doing a pretty good job. And Florida's defense really did show up in this one, though. How much of that was Hawk just being awful, and how much of that was the Florida defense? Probably a little bit of both. But hey, 20-point win against your rival, don't take it for granted. Doesn't happen every year. Didn't happen last year. And so, take it, enjoy it, plant that flag, and make fun of Norvell.
Yeah, that's all you really can do is just enjoy the moment here with Florida State being down, especially. I think man, you look at a team going in next season that they have a lot of questions to answer. Very shocked at how far they fell this year, but you can't take those for granted. Gotta enjoy those wins. And it's like you said, it did feel like we were playing with our food throughout. Maybe study the history of the program. We're not opposed to running it up, Billy. I know you like this. When Johnson hit the run, I texted you. I'm like, you're gonna take this 24-10 win, and you're gonna like it. I think I texted that to you. I'm like, yeah, he's just gonna sit on this, be 24-10. So he scored the other touchdown. That's good. But we're not opposed to 50. We're not opposed to 50 around here. Let's try to run it up. But in all jokes aside, awesome finish down the stretch. This defense especially came on big down the stretch. I know Lagway gets a lot of the love and attention. He deserves every bit of it, especially playing out on one leg. The thing that we were able to answer this year, Will, is we know he's that guy. We know that Lagway is the guy that deserves that level of hype going into next season, and to see that the back half of the season play out, especially, man, that Georgia game was just so devastating when he went down. It really looked like the type of injury that was going to cost him the rest of the season. Somehow he's back playing 2 weeks later. This has the potential to be a pivotal moment in the turning of Florida football back into the glory days. And I know it's just a few games. I know we've only seen the guy. I know I'm setting myself up for disappointment and even believing it will, but at the same time, this program does have the potential. It should be operating on a much higher level than it's been this last decade. And this is the guy that has the type of talent that we haven't seen at the quarterback position since Tim Tebow left Gainesville after the 2009 season.
Yeah, I mean, I said coming into this year that what I wanted out of the 2024 season was certainty. And I think when I said that, what I wanted to know was Billy Napier the guy or was he not? And obviously, 3 or 4 games into the season, I think we all kind of had that answer. So then the question was, can DJ Lagway save the day? And it turns out this team and this offense is a completely different animal when DJ Lagway is a quarterback. And he's still going to need to take another step next year. But the offense was like top 10 with him in there. Again, limited sample size. You have some big games that sort of offset a couple of duds. At the same time, like that's kind of what you expect from a true freshman, a little bit of up, a little bit of down. We saw enough to know that this guy is going to lead an explosive offense. The question is going to be, can he then harness it excuse me, to be a consistent offense. But what I left this season with is the certainty that it's worth trying, right? Irrespective of what I think about Billy Napier as an in-game coach, what I think about his recruiting, all those sorts of things. We'll get to some of that in a
I
minute.
think you have certainty about those.
Well,
You have certainty. It just might not be the type of certainty you want going forward, but you
no,
have
I
it.
mean, look, I think this has always been, and it was an unfair thing to cast on Lagway. But it has always been Lagway or bust. And if they had DJ Uiagalelei instead of DJ Lagway at quarterback, we wouldn't be talking about anything optimistic, right? Even if they had Graham Mertz coming back next year, we wouldn't be talking about something optimistic. If we were talking about them trying to get the kid from Oklahoma, the 5 star, I can't remember his name,
Jackson
Jackson
Arnold.
Arnold.
Yeah.
If they had Jackson Arnold and it's like, oh, we're gonna go get him in the transfer portal, I'd be like, I don't care. Like Jackson Arnold has not shown me enough that I think he's worth, that I think you can hang a national championship banner with him playing quarterback. What I saw in the last 3 games in particular is a very raw player with very unique ability. And I also saw him get better. You saw him starting to figure it out in the games against LSU and Ole Miss. I think in the game against Florida State did some things with cover two that are things he's weak at, but he also just off. Like he was off from an accuracy perspective. It was also sort of his first road game since Tennessee, and that Tennessee game, like true road game, and that Tennessee road game, he wasn't very good. And so, how much of that is learning how to play away from the friendly confines. And then the other part of it is the guy's playing on one leg. And so that's the other thing we have to keep reminding ourselves of, right? Is that this is probably the worst that DJ Lagway is ever going to be. And the guy's 4-0 in games that he starts and finishes, and he's and he's never left a game that he started behind, right? So, I mean, when you think about it, Florida went 7-5, which means they were 3-5 when Lagway wasn't the starter and the finisher. 4-0 with him there. So you look at these teams that are sitting there arguing about being in the playoff at 8-3 or 9-3, and you go, okay, well, is that possible? Would some of these games have flipped? Would Florida have been more competitive against Texas A&M or against Miami or definitely against Tennessee if they'd had him in there the whole game? Would they have been more competitive against Texas? Would they have beaten Georgia if he'd have been in there? Like I think a reasonable person can look at that and say, yeah, Florida would have been much more competitive in all those games. Now, it's still a big step, and I think everyone needs to realize this. From 7-5 to 9-3 is an enormous step. And the reason is that Florida played 7 teams in the top 20 of the ESPN FPI. In fact, in the top 17, the ESPN FPI. They went 2-5. Now they happened to go 2-0 in games that Lagway started and finished, and they went 0-5 in games that he didn't start and finish. However, in order to get to 9-3, you're going to have to go 4-3 in those 7 games next year because you're playing the same schedule. So it's probably going to be a couple of teams will go up, a couple of teams will go down, but you're going to end up with 6 or 7 games
Well,
in that
and
space.
as we're seeing right now, 9-3 in the SEC guarantees you nothing in terms of the college football playoff.
Yeah, so I think when you're South Carolina, that's true. If you're talking about Alabama or South Carolina, who's going to drive eyeballs? And if you're talking about those are pretty equivalent schedules. I think if Florida goes 9-3 next year and goes 4-3 against teams in the top 17 of the ESPN FBI, I think they get in. But all of that to say, it's not a bye. Like it's not a team that's making it to the SEC title game. And when we think about what we really want to see with the Florida program, is we want a team that goes 11-1, plays in the SEC championship game, and has a first round bye in the playoff. Like
Hmm.
that is where we want to see, and that is 2 jumps from where Florida is right now. So I think Lagway gives us hope that we can get there. I think the success that the staff has had in the transfer portal gives me a little bit more hope that they might be able to get there because they've actually been very, very good at bringing in players in the portal. I would guess, and I'm sure we'll do this for the magazine next year, is what's their hit rate? Right? When you actually look in the portal, is it normal? Is it above average? Like those sorts of things. It feels like it's above average, but maybe that's just my perception because DK and Badger and Bridges and all those guys and Pep Howard have already really shown out this year. But we've seen what happens in Tallahassee when you rely on the transfer portal as well. So it's one of those games of Russian roulette. But I think what Florida fans are going to hang their hat on, and what we've learned, the certainty we've gotten, is that DJ Lagway, if they're behind center, is going to give Florida a chance to win every single time they head out there. And look, if he plays like garbage, they're going to lose the game. Just like if any quarterback plays like garbage, they're going to lose the game. But I'm never going to go into a game next year essentially knowing that Florida is outgunned. And that's cool because there were games where we went into this year where we pretty much knew that Florida was outgunned. And, with significant improvements on defense as well, this can be a playoff team and potentially even an SEC championship team. A lot of stuff has to go right. But the first thing that had to go right was DJ Lagway had to be a star. And that kid's going to be a star way sooner than I mean, really, he's going to be a star at the exact time Billy Napier needs him to be, and probably for our sanity, the exact time we need him to be as well.
Well, I think for argument's sake, he might be a star already here. So I think we just got to get him to play at that star level week in and week out. But hey, like I said, next year's gonna have two legs to do that on.
I
So
mean, if he plays like he played, if he plays in every game like he played against Kentucky, the dude's going to win two Heisman trophies. I mean, like not to go Beano Cook here with Ron Paulus for all the old timers here who remember that guy, but he was a big time recruit at Notre Dame and came in there and Beano Cook was the analyst who was saying, "Oh, he's going to win three Heisman's at Notre Dame," and that was before he'd even thrown a pass. And I wasn't there with Lagway, even though I really liked his tape coming in and his statistics coming in at the high school level. But at this point, I mean, most freshmen are conservative, they're relatively efficient, and they're bad downfield. Lagway is the complete opposite. He's aggressive, he's an assassin downfield, and he's really bad in the intermediate range. And so I think that is going to come in a way that teaching someone the deep pass can't. And we saw it this year, right? When Florida came out and tried to have Mertz become the guy he's not and throw deep, all of a sudden the offense looked different. They missed some deep shots. They weren't as efficient. It wasn't until they rolled it back and sort of brought back the 2023 Mertz and started dinking and dunking, and his average depth of target was much lower, that all of a sudden the offense started to be more efficient. It wasn't explosive, but it was more efficient. And then Mertz goes out, Lagway comes in, and now the offense is not efficient, but it's extraordinarily explosive. This offense actually under Lagway much closer resemblance to the one with Anthony Richardson in 2022 than the one under Graham Mertz over the last 2 years. And so, but Richardson left for the NFL, and honestly, if Lagway left for the NFL right now, he'd kind of be like Anthony Richardson, right? Everybody'd be like, "Oh, he's a project. He didn't play very much." Blah blah blah. The good news is we got 2 years for him to build into that to learn. And so hopefully what'll end up happening is that he'll end up with the efficiency of Mertz, but the explosiveness of Richardson. And then what you're looking at is a guy like Kyler Murray, a guy like Baker Mayfield, a guy like Jaden Daniels. Like that is his ceiling is better than some of those guys. In fact, I think the comp is probably Jaden Daniels. Daniels is a little bit quicker in terms of his ability to run, but if you look at his ability to throw downfield for LSU last year, that was the thing that separated him from other quarterbacks in the conference was he was just deadly going deep for the Tigers, and Lagway already has that. And so I think as you fill it in, he's going to get much, much better. So yeah, that's where the hope lies, man, is DJ Lagway has to lead to the promised land, and he's going to need to because we got out recruited again.
exciting times ahead. Only 9 months for a hype train to get completely out of control. And for those of you who are under the age of 35 and maybe even over the age of 35, I hope you appreciated the Ron Paulus reference that Will has made more Ron Paulus references than anyone. I was 10 years old and grew up in the Midwest, so Will was in the Midwest at that time of his life too. So I appreciate a good Ron Paulus reference. But for those of you
No
who
one can say that I do not appreciate the sport and have not been involved for a long time in following the sport. That's for
For
sure.
those of you who don't know who Ron Paulus is, save the time. Don't worry about it.
Go
Don't
look
worry
it
about
up.
it. You're all right.
If you're interested, I have it all. I have an article about how he ruined Notre Dame. So that I'm pretty sure no one on Read Reaction wants to read. So
All right, bowl season here. I mean, this is the best part too. We haven't done this for a couple of years now. Will we get to go to a bowl game? We're talking Liberty Bowl. I'm seeing ReliaQuest Bowl, Gasparilla Bowls out there. I know you talked about that last week, but a couple of Gator Bowl projections or the Birmingham Bowl. USA Today has Florida versus Georgia Tech in the Birmingham Bowl. That would be a really interesting matchup after what we saw the Yellow Jackets do. Well, before we shift into recruiting here. The flag planting was all the rage this weekend. It was all the talk and the conversation after the Ohio State Michigan game ended in a brawl at midfield. You saw a similar scene in Tallahassee. Should we just make it legal? Like, I think that's the rule. I think the rule is the winner does get to plant the flag, and the loser just has to chill about it. Because I'm okay with the flag planting in general. And I know people talk about like, hey, be the bigger team, take the high road on that. You see Florida State carry the gator head around when they win. They have their tradition where they cut a piece of turf or wherever they win a game, they take it back to the sod cemetery. They have their own things that they do. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like planting a flag is completely obnoxious. And I can remember back when Mayfield did it at Ohio State after Oklahoma beat Ohio State, but there were no Buckeyes around, and it seemed like a thing where the Sooner team kind of hung out and did that after the fact. If there's a situation where some sort of celebration is able to go on like that, I think it's okay. But you got to think the NCAA or someone, whoever the hell's in charge of this sport nowadays, is going to look into this and really try to do something about it in the offseason because a lot of situations going on the field this weekend.
I mean, I guess I just I don't care. Like you lose, go back to the locker room. Like now, I don't think you should vandalize the place, right? Like I think if you're doing something that like causes problems and permanent damage, well, that's one thing. If you're like graffitiing the locker room or tearing it apart or something like that, that's another. But planting the flag at midfield doesn't really do anything to the field. And quite honestly, they go out there and throw that stupid spear every time before the game happens. So it's not like they're worried about what it's going to do to the field. It's just a bunch of guys who have their pride hurt. And I'm sitting there going, good, plan it. Let them start a fight because you know what? You should have your pride hurt because you just got your butt whipped by a team that quite honestly went out and just sort of like I said, like a cat, just played with you the entire time, right? If Florida had wanted to score 70 points in this game, they could have. And these kids are all friends. Most of them played against each other in high school. Let them have a fun moment. And you got Norvell out there wagging his finger. You got Napier afterwards going, "I'm really sorry. We'll never do that again." Like, to hell with that. He should have gone out there and said, "I will do it every single time we beat these guys at Ron Zook Field. And if you don't like it, then beat us." Right? And that attitude, the Florida fan base would have been like, give that man some more NIL money if he'd have gone out and done that. Like, if you're gonna win, enjoy it, man. Like I get it, and Napier's not that guy, and that's fine. I mean, he doesn't need to be, but the hand wringing and the prudishness of we're not going to celebrate a win.
If
Like,
someone
what are we doing here?
if
Like,
someone
isn't that
makes
the whole point?
more than a 6 yard catch against us, we have to watch them do the gator chomp. We are the last fan base to talk to about this stuff. So, hey, in general, like I understand the concerns around it, but all the same people who are complaining about it are going to be cutting those clips up into the rivalry reel for the introduction to next year's game. So
Well, and if the
it's
SEC
something
wants to
that as much as they want to pretend like there's an issue, that it's just a part of the rivalry. It's not that big a deal.
if the SEC wants to stop it, they just need to do what they need to do what they did up there for the Michigan Ohio State game. Pepper spray the bastards. Like be like, you can plant the flag, just realize you're not gonna be able to feel your eyes for about 3 hours
Hey, the
afterwards.
Franklin County sheriffs they were pepper spraying Buckeyes too. It was just pepper spraying everywhere, just wild, going wild
I
with
mean,
the
it is
pepper spray.
funny when Max and I went down for the LSU game. Spurrier at his grill had talked about, maybe
Swarm the
if we win,
swamp.
maybe if we win, we should swarm the field. They had more security out there, like basically like to start the fourth quarter, and every time there was a break, they put up a sign basically saying, "You will go to jail if you do this." So look, there is a way to set up incentives to stop that sort of behavior. And they obviously don't do that at places like Ole Miss and Alabama, or maybe Alabama, but other places where they've swarmed the field, certainly at like Vanderbilt, stuff like that. Those folks feel like it's worth paying the fine that you get when everybody goes on the field. Florida's like, screw it, we'll pay $100,000 for security, so we don't have to pay a $250,000 fine. There are ways to stop it if you want to stop it, but to be honest, I think, like you said, it's part of the rivalry. Sack up, man. If you want to complain that someone's celebrating on your field, don't get beat by 20. And don't do it the year before, right? Like it's the whole like, I don't know. Win the damn game. If you don't want people to celebrate on your field, win the game.
Yeah, yeah. Seen Florida State try to have some fun on a midfield logo in Gainesville too. So it's a rivalry. It is what it is. All right, let's talk about recruiting here. We're gonna go through this class as quick as we can. We're starting on the defense side of the ball. Before I dive in, talk about some of Billy Napier's comments about the class. He basically said this is going to be a shift. It's they got to be up for the challenge. Before it was more talking about being up for the challenge, bringing the program back. Now you've actually seen, he said, the missing piece was the on the field, showing that winning formula, demonstrating it to the fan base, not only the fan base, but the recruits. And they saw some of that down the stretch. So he says, we're not done. We showed promise. There's more to do. And I like that message. It's a totally different mentality you're going into, Will, but you saw some recruits buy in late, lots of flips. Maybe it was some of that buyout money that they had together for Billy. Maybe it's because some of the messages were actually getting through and there's a little bit of excitement. You're not selling the promise of a DJ Lagway led Gator team heading into 2025. These guys have seen it with their own eyes.
I mean, I guess I think a lot of it has to do with the minute that Scott Strickland gave the vote of confidence to Billy Napier, all the guys who would have committed to Florida but were on the fence because they didn't want to have to essentially transfer after they committed if Napier was fired, all said, okay, I'll come. Right. And so, yes, it was a late set of flips. Yes, it was a late set of very good players who joined the class. At the same time, it's one of those things where, um, so a couple of weeks ago, after the vote of confidence, I basically said, "Hey, the recruiting's at 51st, but that's a mirage. If you look at the average player rating, Florida's like 16th or something like that in the country." And if you look at where Florida sits in terms of average player rating today, it's like 14th. So, Florida, in terms of player quality, Florida has not seen a significant rise. In terms of player quantity, Florida has seen a significant rise. And so that to me is the message here is that Florida put together a class that's ranked 11th overall on 24/7 composite. From a points perspective, it's ranked, I got to go back. I haven't actually had a chance as things have settled, but it's going to be 13th or 14th in terms of average player rating. They could have really made a difference. They could have brought in some guys today who would have made a difference. Dallas Wilson, 5-star wide receiver from the state of Florida. He was a guy who really all the buzz was he was going to be the Florida, and he decided to stay to Oklahoma. Solomon Thomas, who
Oregon,
was at Florida's
Oregon,
Oregon. That's right.
Tampa kid. Yep.
Solomon Thomas, another 5-star. He was a guy who you looked at and said, okay, a Florida State guy, an in-state guy who actually wants to stay at Florida State. This should be a flip, and he flips to LSU. So the two like sort of crown jewels they could have added to the class end up going elsewhere. And so what ends up happening is this is a class that is very, very strong in the middle in terms of talent. It's relatively weak up top. And that's very similar to some other classes that Billy Napier's had. Last year's funny. Last year's class was very strong up top and kind of weak in the middle after all the guys who flipped. This one's strong in the middle and weak up top. And the result is you got a class that, depending upon where you're gonna go, is gonna be ranked somewhere between 10th and 15th. And that is what it is, right? I mean, it's way better than where it was 3 weeks ago from a volume perspective, but from a player rating perspective, we're not really moving the needle much from where it was 3 weeks ago, and not moving the needle that much from where it has been historically under Billy Napier.
Well, let's start along the defensive front. You have Jalen Wiggins, who's been committed for quite a while out of Tallahassee, 6'4.5", 255. I'm gonna go through quick hits on each player, Will, and then I'll cut over to you for each position here. But Jalen Wiggins, 6'4" and a half, 255 out of Tallahassee. Napier referred to him as extra effort player. Jaden Woods out of Kansas was a Penn State flip. Super athletic kid. He's playing a lot of linebacker. Napier said he could rush. He'll be able to run. He's loose hipped. He can play on special teams. Just a phenomenal human being and worker. Joseph Mbaktu. I'm probably screwing that name up. I heard Napier say it at the press conference, but I've heard it a couple times. But that's one. Some of these names you take a few times to learn. There, out of Georgia, said he was newer to the game of football. Referred to him as a hidden gem. He had recently flipped to Texas, flipped back to Florida here. You have Jeremiah McLeod, another kid that was heavily pursued elsewhere. He said Napier referred to him as a linebacker who grew into a defensive lineman. So very quick, very athletic kid for playing up front. But my favorite player up front, Will, we're losing Des Watson this year. Napier referenced him in the press conference from Brentwood, Tennessee. Stephon Shivers, uh, just a massive athlete. One of my favorite highlight films of anyone we saw. This guy is 6'4" and a half, 365 pounds. Played running back. Played running back here. The guy can and he would actually break some very long runs. Napier said he was a very good basketball player as well. So the big fella is fairly athletic. I mean, we saw, look, Dez didn't ever get the weight in check while he was at Florida, but that man moved in in a way that a guy that size had no business moving. So it's another big body like that to put in the middle of the line with Dez Watson walking out the door.
Yeah, I mean, so to start with, we always talk about stacking when we talk about recruiting. And Jaden Woods, like you said, edge guy, 129th ranked player overall. You got Jalen Wiggins, edge, 142nd overall. Woods, 6'3", 240. Wiggins, 6'4" and a half, 255. Think about where Florida hasn't been able to get pressure over the last few years. Like they, especially this year, even as things have really kicked into gear in terms of getting pressure, it's been up the middle. It's been Caleb Banks, it's been Cam Jackson, hasn't necessarily been around the edge. So the hope is that those guys are really going to be able to bring some of that and going to be able to really early on provide Florida some athleticism on the edge. And then, like you mentioned, Shivers, it's so much fun to watch this film when they put him at running back and all of a sudden there's a safety who's like 6'2", 200, and he's 6'4", 365, and he's cutting and weaving and all sorts of stuff when he's a running back. So from, you think about again, we've talked for 3 or 4 years now about Florida not getting pressure up the middle. Watson isn't a guy who gets pressure up the middle. That's been left to Banks and Jackson. I think Shivers is a guy that hopefully we can anticipate is going to be able to sort of fill that Banks role and be able to be quick off the ball. A guy more like Warren Sapp than a guy like Des Watson or Terrence Cody, right? Those guys were space eaters and block occupiers. I don't think that Shivers necessarily that's what his ceiling is. I think his ceiling is much, much better than just being somebody who's occupying blockers so that everyone else can make plays. But he's also 6'4" and a half, 365 pounds. And so if they ask him to occupy blockers so that the linebackers like Jaden Robinson and Shamar James and Pup Howard can flow to the ball, he should be able to do that as well. So, yeah, I mean, look, I think Florida got much, much better on the defensive line with this class. Like I said, stacking some of those guys I think is important, and excited to see what these guys can do in 2025.
Let's move up to the linebackers here. A couple really solid players. I mean, if you just talk about in terms of like just watching these guys play, two guys that can be contributors at some point during their careers as really quality starters. Ty Jackson, who Napier referred to as one of the best football players he's ever watched on film. That's pretty high praise. He talked about maybe lacking at the top end of this class. He's a four-star backer, 6'1", 200. So he's got a lot of clips where, I mean, this guy returns kicks. He does everything. Well, he does everything. Just a total package, total athlete. Definitely needs to bulk up a little bit at that linebacker spot, but just a freak athlete who can fly around, do everything. Had been committed to the USC Trojans at one point, recent flip to Florida. Another one that had decommitted from another school here from Alabama, from Bruton, Alabama, Miles Johnson, 6'1", 220, just a really solidly built kid. Missed his junior season at Burton with an ACL injury, so he recovered from that before his senior season here. So definitely concern when you take a guy on that had some major injuries. There's a few of those guys in this class that had serious leg injuries throughout their careers in high school that they've recovered from or will be recovering from coming in. But Johnson was a guy that at one point committed to Nick Saban's Alabama, and it certainly can hit, certainly can flow from side to side and can hit. He's really your quintessential stereotypical looking linebacker.
Yeah, so you think about what Florida's got at linebacker with Aaron Childs and Miles Graham and Pup Howard. They've got a lot of youth there, right? So they don't necessarily need Johnson to come in and be awesome right away. but certainly somebody who can lay the wood on special teams, or somebody who, look, if he excels, has an opportunity to get on the field, that's great. I think certainly a developmental prospect, at least when compared to Jackson. Jackson is a guy who, if you watch his highlights, you're like, he's going to need to learn how to wrap up. But he doesn't have to wrap up in high school because he hits people so damn hard they just go flying, and so I think there's some stuff that he's going to need to learn. But again, I think he's learning from guys who are pretty entrenched in terms of being effective players for Florida. 2 years ago, Florida's linebackers were undoubtedly the weak spot on the defense. And right now, if you ask me, where does Florida need to add in the portal, linebacker is not a spot. And so Jackson and Johnson here, I think, are going to be guys who have an opportunity to grow into those positions, start out contributing on special teams. And then obviously, if you have some injuries, then you'll need those guys to step up like some of the other guys stepped up this year. But they'll have an opportunity to learn. I think they have some raw skills that Florida will be able to exploit.
Stepping into the defensive backfield here, Ben Hanks Jr., the son of former two-time All SEC linebacker Ben Hanks from the 94 and 95 seasons. He was All SEC. Napier said about him and Vernell Brown. We'll get to Vernell Brown in a minute, but he said it's in the DNA. It's in the DNA. I love that. Napier said this at the press conference tonight. We're recording this on a Wednesday night here. I think it's important to add players like that to your team because I think they care. Napier referred to both him, Hanks, and Brown. Both fit exactly what we're looking for. Both are home runs for this class. It just means a little bit more to them. He said during when it heads into crunch time. Nate Hanks Jr. though, great player on his own right. He's a long corner, 6'1", 170, had 13 interceptions, set a Miami-Dade County record.
Yeah, man. I mean, look, I think Hank's very, very good. I think he's really sort of the only cornerback in the class, though. And that is one of the things that I think, we talk about stacking. They haven't really stacked anybody at corner. Jason Marshall's going to be gone. Devin Moore's had injury concerns. Obviously, you've had some guys like Cormani McLean and Jameer Grimsley step up over the last few weeks. Dijon Johnson as well. At the same time, you're going to need to build depth because of what we saw this year. And so Hanks is going to be a big part of that. He should be somebody who can contribute. But, this is kind of the ranking of guys like Jakeem Jackson and those ilks. So guys that work out probably about 20 to 25% of the time. And it's entirely possible Hanks is going to be awesome out there. But we'll have to see. He's still going to have some stuff to prove at the next level.
The safety position, you bring in two highly touted safeties. At one point, Hilton Stubbs out of Mandarin High School got a couple Mandarin Mustangs coming down to Gainesville from Duval County. He was committed to the USC Trojans, and then he was committed to Miami, and he finishes up at Florida. Uh, Big time flip recently, high level 4-star kid, just a super athletic tape. I seemed like a total ball hawk on the highlight reel, and he can hit too. A couple of plays he just would fly up and lay a kid out. Another high level safety that just recently flipped from Tennessee is a Georgia kid, 6 foot. He's a Tennessee volunteer commit from Georgia. Laganza Hayward, 6'1", 200, another physical safety. Played some wide receiver in high school. Also, really a high level 4-star kid. Will big time flip from the Volunteers. Big time flip from the Hurricanes. It's two opponents on your next schedule on next season's schedule. So good to have them in orange and blue instead of those uglier shades of orange.
Well, I mean, if you think about where Florida's defense has struggled now for probably 4 or 5 years, safety is like at the top of the list. So to add two guys, one ranked 57th overall, one ranked 72nd overall, one from Jacksonville, one from Georgia. And I think honestly, if we look overall at the theme here for this recruiting class, is the last couple of years, Florida's had to go all over the country really to bring in solid, not elite, but solid recruiting classes. I think this one they brought in a solid class, had a shot at a couple of 5 stars to really push it into that top 6, top 7 range. Weren't able to do that, but at the same time, they got a lot of guys from the state of Florida. I think they're making inroads in the state of Florida. And one of the things I said on Gators Breakdown this week was, NIL money, pretty much at this point, you should kind of know what people are going to cost and what they're going to ask for, which means all the other stuff, the culture stuff, the, hey, I'm staying close to home and my parents can come see me, all those sorts of things become much more important for guys in this range, especially because they're not making, these guys aren't making millions of dollars a year. They're probably in the, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, I would guess. And so it's not like they're going to be able to fly mom and dad out to see them every single week and those sorts of things. So keeping guys from the state of Florida has been a priority. We've talked about it for years now. Been Billy Napier. It's always a highlight in the magazine. I'll be really curious when you do it again this year, because it feels like the average recruit distance for this class is going to be much, much narrower than it has been in past years. In the past years, it's been like 300-400 miles for the average recruit distance. I mean, this class has like a ton of people from Orlando and Jacksonville, and so good to see Billy Napier doing that, and good to see him bring in safeties who hopefully are going to be able to tighten up that defense on the back
Well,
end.
normally when you think about a traditional Florida roster, you think about Orlando, Jacksonville, Tampa, but a couple of solid pickups out in the Panhandle, a couple in South Florida. We highlighted that in the magazine last year that during the first few years of Napier, they had not done much work in South Florida. I mean, they might have done the work, but they hadn't gotten a lot of results out of South Florida. And hey, I'm not saying you should be pulling as many recruits as like a Miami in their backyard, but you should be pulling a few here and there, and they certainly have picked up their game in this class in South Florida. Let's go along the offensive front. Well, I told you I love Shivers. Tavares Dice, the recent flip from Auburn, nasty, mean. He's a mean kid. Well, he's a bully. He finishes his blocks. He's not afraid to really jump on the pile or really jump on a kid late. I loved his clips on HUDL there. Napier said he can also maybe play tackle. I think he's got some position flex. He's got the power to play guard though. And Will, I mean, this is the type of kid on the interior part of the line. Definitely seems like he has the right mentality. Another high level 4-star kid. You also added Daniel Pierre Louis, who actually was teammates with Ty Jackson, the linebacker. Napier referred to him as one of the freakier guys. He's a human forklift. So I'll let you process that one for a minute there. A human forklift. That's kind of how I would describe him. Napier said, we've had a couple guys like him in the past at Louisiana, 6'4" and a quarter, really long, 35-inch arms, 84 wingspan, really good bender. He's got good functional movement, extremely smart, very bright, very knowledgeable about football, studies players. Jahari Medlock was another guy they added to, more of a tackle. Napier referred to his athleticism, said I think he could play defense as well. So Medlock is a 6'6", 278-pound kid. Uh, Pierre Louis, 6'4", 290. So few big bodies along that offensive front at a position group that was really struggling early on in this class. Definitely a couple nice pickups in there.
Yeah, I mean, so Dice is obviously the crown jewel of all the offensive linemen, ranked 191st overall, from Georgia, so relatively close to home, though not not in the state of Florida. And then you've added a couple of 3 stars in in Medlock and Pierre Louis. Pierre Louis is actually an interior offensive lineman by training, right? So 6'4.5", 290. Medlock is a tackle, huge dude, 6'6", 278. And then you've got Dice, who's 6'4", 295. So he's one of those guys who probably could be either inside or outside, depending upon what Florida needs and how early they want him to play. I think this is one of those cases where, so Bill Sykes wrote an article on Read and Reaction a couple years ago about the offensive line at Florida specifically, and he sort of highlighted numbers as being critical. And maybe in the transfer portal era, that's not as important. But what Bill basically found was that you needed 4 offensive linemen in a class to sort of maintain offensive line continuity over the long term. And if you think about it, the trenches is where guys tend to transfer less often. It's where you tend to need to develop over time, right? A lot of times, good offensive linemen don't become good until their junior or senior year in the SEC because they've had time to spend time in the weight room. So this is where the miss on Solomon Thomas really stands out to me, because Thomas would have made this 4 offensive linemen. You would have had an elite offensive lineman, a blue chip offensive lineman, and a couple of 3-star development projects. And you would have said, hey, that's a really good class. So I'm happy with the guys that Florida's brought into this class, but they did sort of miss the I don't even want to say the cherry on top of the sundae. I mean, they maybe the whipped cream on top of the sundae, because Thomas would have sort of made the stacking work out well from a numbers perspective and an ability perspective. So a little bit disappointing today, but these are going to be good players for Florida for years to come.
Let's head outside here. Vernell Brown, the third wide receiver. I would refer to him as the highest profile commit in this class. Certainly, legacy carries some weight around here. His father played here in the mid 2000s, grandfather in the mid 80s. Andrew Ivins from 24/7 calls him a dynamic athlete with elite short area quickness and explosive movement patterns, has impacted the game in all three phases at the prep level and impressed at times as a defensive back, but his ceiling appears to be highest at slot. And he can generate chunk plays with his run after catch capabilities. Will, this is the guy if you're looking for a name that can make an impact early, much like we saw from Trey Wilson a couple of years ago. I think Vernell Brown the third is that guy. I'll kick it over to you for a sec before we talk about the other receivers.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you think about that profile, right? 5'11", 170, talking about quick game, talking about getting open really quick, off the ball, quick separation. Those are not necessarily things that I immediately look at and go, yeah, that's what DJ Lagway needs, right? I sort of say, where do we get the tall guy who's on the outside who can race down the sideline and beat those guys? Now, certainly, Vernell Brown is a five-star guy, and so he's got some real speed, and he's going to be able to do some of those things. But that to me is one of those things where I'm going to be really interested to see. I think if Vernell Brown has a big freshman season, or obviously we got Trey Wilson potentially coming back as well. If he has a big season, that really portends well for DJ Lagway and his development, right? Because the quick twitch guys, the guys who are open right off the snap, that has not been a strength of Lagway this year. And so if Brown ends up catching 34, 35 balls next year, I think what we're going to be able to say is, okay, yeah, like Lagway really developed. Now, I will say, having a guy of Brown's ability being able to step into that Trey Wilson role, we've seen how Wilson is used, right? And so there's probably an opportunity here to sort of double up when Wilson goes off the field. Obviously, Wilson's had surgery too, so we'll see how he recovers from that too. So look, you don't say no to any five-star kid. And certainly, I'm excited to see what Brown can do. But I'm also really fascinated to see what he can do given Lagway and his specific set of skills, and what development for Lagway would mean.
Trey Wilson, by the way, confirms he's going to be returning to Florida next year. I know there was some speculation when he went out with that injury. I think he had only played 4 games here, that the red shirt was still available. So, uh, good news from Trey Wilson. And, I'm just grateful too because he was on the magazine cover. And if we went 2 for 2 with transfers out the gate, well, I don't know. I
Well,
would
well,
feel I would not want to. I don't know. We might have to talk about not putting Lagway on the cover if we were going to do
well,
some kind of Madden curse on the program here.
well, it
So
sounds like Voldemort might want to come back. So we'll see if that happens.
nope. Nashawn Montgomery, another receiver coming in from Miami Central, 6'1", 165. I think he bulked up and put on a little weight this season. This 24/7 has him listed as 165. Saw somewhere else 175. But man, he can burn. He flirted with Louisville and Alabama late, but he is quick, Will. He's the type of guy that can get down the field. A lot of athletic receptions, catching the ball over DBs, like along the sideline too. He's the type of guy that he really seems like a do-it-all receiver, but with the capability to take the top off of defense. The last one was a late addition, a flip out of Texas from League City, Texas. Was an Arizona commit. Muiz Tankara. I've gone through the name. I practiced it. I just butchered it hard right there. That's another one. Some of these names, we'll get it down. We'll get it down. But Tankara coming out of Texas, per Gabe Brooks of 24/7, capable of winning contested throws in traffic thanks to his frame. Again, he is 6'3" and a half, 195. High point, has a great ability to high point and body control in the air. Looks tough on tape. Willingness to work the middle of the field and affect the screen and perimeter run game as well as a blocker.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Montgomery's 6'1", 165. You called him a burner. Look at Aiden Mizell, 6'2", 167.
Very
So
similar.
you can see Florida sort of doubling up when you think about Brown being the potential replacement, heir apparent to Trey Wilson eventually. You think about Montgomery being the heir apparent and the replacement for Mizell. And then you look at a guy like Tunkara, 6 foot 3.5, 195. That's sort of the back shoulder Elijah Badger type of profile, right? So Florida in this class has brought in wide receivers with size and ability requirements to sort of match some of the players that they've had in there. Look, I think the wide receiver room at this point is pretty strong. You mentioned Wilson coming back. Obviously, Badger and DK are going to be leaving. You got to replace those guys. I'm sure that they will attempt to do that in the portal, but certainly having a guy like Brown come in, a guy like Montgomery come in, and then even potentially a guy like Tankara coming in allows you some flexibility. That, if you just had a bunch of guys who are all 6'3", 195, or a bunch of guys who are all 5'9", 165, what do you do with them, right? You need and honestly, Florida, because of what they do on offense, needs wide receivers who can block too. And so, in many ways, that's kind of how you get on the field in Billy Napier's offense, is if you're a wide receiver who can block. We actually saw a few times where Badger wasn't necessarily willing to block in the games where Aiden Warner was in there and a couple guys got smacked. So that'll be important, and I'm sure these guys can contribute in that way.
Yeah, and they've done a good job at receiver through the portal. Certainly a position where when Napier came in, that was a pretty bleak spot at times. We had a couple good receivers at the top, but in terms of the depth, it was pretty rough. And seems like they are much like the running back room. They are securing that depth in the wide receiver room. At tight end, you had a flip today with I believe Gelsey flipping out of Jacksonville, flipped to Florida State, but Micah Jones did sign out of Mississippi. Just a big body tight end. It looks like he's going to be a solid blocker. He's not going to be the guy that's going to make a ton of catches for you probably, but Billy Napier loves his tight ends. Going to be an impact guy in the run game.
Well, look, I mean, Hayden Hansen was a sort of late addition to the class when he came in, but sort of the same type of thing, right? A big dude who is going to be able to block, and then the question is, what can you develop off of that? And I think that's really what we'll sort of look at for Micah Jones is how can he come in and contribute in the running game? How can he contribute in terms of essentially being an extra blocker? And then whatever he can do in the passing game, especially early on, will sort of be a bonus. But, look, Florida with Livingston, he's really stepped up this year. We've seen some flashes from him. Boardingham kind of taking a step back this year. Hansen has taken another step forward. So, okay at that position. No real stars, but okay. So the addition of Jones is a good addition that hopefully will sort of mimic some of the things we've seen from some of the guys in there already.
Let's go through the running back spot here from Katy Jordan High School in Texas. Chad Gasper he was early on the train, one of the earlier commits, three-star kid, 5'10", 200, just really solidly built. He's really just it seems like he's the type of guy that can make a decision and go. He's not going to dance around too much. Has the ability to break it. I don't know if he's necessarily the fastest guy, but he's just a really solid, stout runner. Is there any position you trust more as a Gator fan at this moment than Billy Napier and Jabbar Jalouk's ability to evaluate running backs? It just seems like these guys that they brought in here are all right along those lines. But he had an injury last year. Gasper had held him to 3 games played this season. So not a ton of time on the field this season. Seems like he'll be recovering a little bit. A lot of depth in the running back room. True freshman coming in. I'm sure he'll have the ability to redshirt next year and figure it out. Waltez Clark, I believe he was the first one committed in this class. Identified early, 4-star kid out of Plant High School in Tampa. Good speed. Napier said in his press conference about him, runs the full route tree. He can kick and punt, has kick and punt return ability too. His highlight reels are full of kick returns and punt returns. A lot of receiver. He did play a lot of receiver in high school. It looked like too, but he's another type of running back too. Doesn't waste a lot of time getting upfield. And then last one here at the running back spot, Byron Lewis. I think we called him Byron Louis last week. We went a little French with it. It's Lewis. We checked it out. It's Lewis, American Heritage High School, 5'11", 200 pounds, another solidly built kid. Rushed for 3,200 yards and 45 touchdowns and 423 carries over 41 games for American Heritage. Not much of a receiver. He had 8 catches as a senior. But definitely a guy with some big playability coming in late flip from Florida State.
Yeah, so Gasper 5'10", 200. You get Lewis 5'11", 200. So kind of very similar builds. If you look at Clark 6'1", 194. So, he's a guy who I think more upright, probably, there'll be some differences in terms of what those guys do. But like you mentioned, I mean, Billy Napier with ETN coming in his first year, with Baugh and Jackson this year, has really established the fact that they're going to do a decent job of filling out that room. A little bit surprised that they signed three of them. Again, scholarship limitations and things like that are less important these days than it used to be. Probably an indication that there are some transfers coming. Obviously, you're going to lose Montrell Johnson, but Trayon Webb had a pretty significant leg injury. We'll see whether he decides to stay, and then also, whether he's able to recover from that injury as well. So maybe that was the thinking too. Is you take three guys, you're pretty sure you're going to hit on one of them. And given their track record, maybe even hit on two of them,
Hmm.
but that'd give you the ability to weather any sort of storms from an injury perspective. And look, I'm not sure any back under Billy Napier's gotten more than 15 carries a game. One of the commitments that they make to the running backs is that they're going to keep them fresh. And look, I mean, Jaden Baugh, as good as he is, isn't going to get 35 rushes a game. They're just not going to do that to the kid. And so having a lot of depth in the room is important, and these guys are all going to be able to deliver that.
I don't know what team across the country is going to hand the ball off to the same back 35 times these days, except maybe Boise
I
State
was
right
going to say
now.
Boise State, baby.
Maybe your Heisman winner next Saturday night, but it's not common anymore for sure. Quarterback Tramel Jones out of Mandarin High School, teammate with Hilton Stubbs there. Jacksonville, Florida, Duval County, 4-star commit, one time Florida State, long time Florida State commit actually. Another guy who was injured this year, carted off the field early in the season, I believe the second game of the year against Atlantic Coast. It said. Just really a solid player. Will, he's not the biggest guy, 6 foot 196, undersized kid, but seems like he's got toughness about him. Seems like he can hang in the pocket, make a good throw, and he's got some mobility to his game too.
Well, I mean, look, I think one of the things that you have to make sure of is that you have a quarterback in every class. You want a blue chip recruit in every class. And it's very difficult to bring in like 5-star quarterbacks the year after you bring in a guy like Lagway. And so the idea that Florida was going to bring in, Bryce Underwood this year after bringing in Lagway last year, that's not realistic. And you need to think about how do we stack quarterbacks. And there was some talk about one of the quarterbacks who was committed to Georgia. Maybe they'd be able to get him to flip and those sorts of things. But I think you're good with one quarterback in every class. You just need to make sure you don't miss, right? So Florida had Austin Simmons flip on him a couple years ago. Obviously, everyone's familiar with what happened with Jaden Rashada. And what did we end up with? We ended up with Aiden Warner starting after a couple of guys went down.
Hmm.
You had to go get Graham Mertz in the transfer portal. You had to wait for Lagway. And then when both of those guys got injured, now you're sitting there with a walk on having him play as opposed to a recruit with high level talent who maybe is a little bit raw. And so bringing in a guy like Jones sort of protects against that, right? He's not going to come in and dethrone Lagway, right? Like that's not going to happen. But what's going to happen is you got Will Griffin coming in the 2026 class. And so now what you've really done is sort of established this succession of quarterbacks and making sure that if there's an injury, if there's an issue, like we talked about Florida and really other teams in the SEC needing to get to 9-3 to get in the playoff. Well, if Lagway goes down with an injury, you got to have somebody who's able to step in. I don't know whether Jones will be ready to step in this year, but 2 years from now,
Sure.
if something were to happen to Lagway, you've now got a high level blue chip guy with a lot of talent. and honestly, some of the same skills as well, who can jump in and potentially you have the ability, like the kid should be able to come in and at least you've got some hope that he can play well rather than having to find someone in the transfer portal. And again, if you're bringing somebody from the transfer portal, how do you find a guy who wants to play behind Lagway? So finding that guy, finding a blue chip guy who's not afraid of competition, who wants to learn and is okay learning behind Lagway for a couple years is really an important part of what Tramel Jones brings to the equation.
So right now, I'm looking ahead to 2025, and we saw what the Texas game looked like. We're quite vulnerable at that backup spot, I would say.
One hamstring away from losing by 50. Yep.
At least for 1 week. At least for 1 week. We got the same schedule next year. Are heavily targeting quarterback in the portal, you think?
Eh, I mean, maybe like they brought in Clay Millen, and Millen had had a pretty decent season at a FBS
Did they have an
team.
opportunity to play him this year?
I mean, he was eligible. They just decided not to.
That's
So,
that's what I'm saying. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that they see him in the picture. If he couldn't get on the field in that Texas game, I'm not sure if there's a future for him on the field.
well, and that's kind of my point, right? Is that if you're a kid in the transfer portal, you want to transfer someplace where you're going to have an opportunity to at least compete for the job. Like if you're a competent quarterback who's a Division 1, like capable of winning a couple of games for a team that wants to compete for the playoff, you're gonna have to like there at least has to be an open competition when you come. Maybe you lose the competition, but there has to be an open competition. There's no competition in Gainesville.
Can we go
If
swipe it back up?
well, I mean, I don't know. Does Will Howard have another year of eligibility? Like get
Let's
him
go
out of
swipe
Ohio
it
State.
back up, man. I'm
I
good
mean,
with that.
there. I mean, if you could bring in Jackson Arnold and tell him you're going to back up Lagway for 2 years, but that's sort of the problem, right? Is that the backup that you're going to swipe could go like if he's really good, like if he can really win SEC games, he's going to go to Purdue in the transfer portal. He's going to go to Rutgers. He's going to go to Tulane. Like they're going to pick a place where they have an opportunity to actually show what they can do if they're good. If they're not, they're going to want to come, then yeah, they'll come, but what are you really getting there? So I think building, and this is where I think one quarterback a class is critical. I think four offensive linemen per class is critical for high school recruiting. I think you can fill skill position spots through the portal. We've seen that with DK, we've seen that with Badger, even going back to Van Jefferson and Trevon Grimes. Like we've seen skill positions get filled through the transfer portal. I think some of the places where it becomes very difficult is offensive line, defensive line, those sorts of things. You just have to have enough numbers to where maybe you got to plug one hole in the offensive line. Maybe you got to plug one hole on the defensive line, but you're probably not getting a guy who's just going to dominate the minute you bring him in through the transfer portal. I think Florida was really fortunate years ago when they got John Grenard coming in through the transfer portal, who really was a difference maker at defensive end. You don't get that guy a lot. And so to me, it's four offensive linemen. It's make sure you have a quarterback every class, and then there's some nuance in terms of who you might want to sign around that. But those are sort of the benchmarks, at least from a numbers perspective, that I would be looking at. And Florida came pretty close to getting that in this one. Didn't quite get there on the offensive line.
You know what? It's not going to matter anyway. Lagway's not getting hurt. We're going to the playoffs. It's fine. It's fine.
Well,
Uh,
he's going to be on the cover this year, so I hope you're right.
Evan Noel comes in at the kicker. We signed one kicker, one punter. Noel Napier had cited that he hit a 62-yarder when they had him down visiting. They said we tried to ice him twice. He still hit it. So Napier also said that he does not give many elite grades when he evaluates talent, and Noel received an elite grade. So it sounds like we've got a solid kicker coming in here behind Trey Smack. Hayden Craig is a lefty punter from Maine, it says. Good kicker in his high school too. Napier says he hit a 50-yard field goal to win the game, 6'2", 190. So big guy, lefty out of Maine coming in to seemingly be the heir apparent to the departing Jeremy Crawshaw.
Yeah, good. I mean, Florida has been bad on special teams most of the time. They've been much better this year, and so Joe Houston should get a lot of credit for that. But certainly the skill players that he's got. I mean, I can't remember the last time Smack missed. I can't remember the last time that I looked up and there was like a duck coming off of Crawshaw's leg. Right? He's been able to flip the game a few times. So clearly that's an important part of the game. Those aren't guys that you necessarily look at and go, they're going to lead us back to prominence. But you think about some big moments in Florida history, and certainly field goals play a part of that, but then also like the thing that jumps to mind is the punt against Arkansas, where Arkansas muffs it, Florida picks it up, and all of a sudden in the SEC championship in what was it, 2006,
Wani
Florida,
Pierre Louis.
yeah, all the momentum shifts, right? And so even if you think about the Ole Miss game, right? I mean, you kick a good punt, it gets muffed.
Right.
All of a sudden, you're in business. Florida scores 3 points in that in the third quarter without gaining a yard on that drive. So it's important, obviously, but probably not make or break for the program.
Are those guys that we have as signed as of the first day of early National Signing Day, December 7th? And as of December 7th, the portal talk has started. We've had a few guys already announce intentions. Guard Mike Williams, wide receiver Andy Jean on the offensive side. Will, hey, Jean's one of those guys. Loved his clips coming in before he got to Florida. A kid out of Miami, one of the South Florida kids we were able to bring in. Just couldn't stay healthy, Will. I think that was a big part of his time at Florida.
Yeah, I mean, look, we had in the magazine 2 years ago. I had a big piece about when you bring in three blue chip recruits, how many of them work out, and the answer is usually one. And so Trey Wilson worked out. Aiden Mizell is starting to work out a little bit. So Florida is probably ahead of the game when it comes to what you would get when you bring in three blue chip wide receivers. The idea that all three of those guys were going to hit and that they were all going to be fantastic is just not based in reality. And like you mentioned, Gene has struggled to stay healthy. And so he's sort of the odd man out when it comes to that sort of thing and wants to get a fresh start someplace else. And so, wish him well. Hope he does well wherever he goes, as long as he doesn't go to Georgia. And, we'll sort of move on because, again, I think the Florida program has moved on from Andy Gene in some respects as well, just based on the Marcus Burke stepping up and Aiden Mizell stepping up and Trey Wilson staying and those sorts of things. And so it was time to move on, and that's okay.
On the defensive side, three edge players: Justice Boone, Quincy Ivory, Bryce Capers, all in the portal. And Will, these two names, these are two guys that I think they stick around. They have a very good careers here. But early on, it's tough to catch on. We're expecting all these guys to catch on as the expectation now is you got to catch on as a freshman or sophomore, otherwise you might hit the portal. It used to be that if you played at all as a freshman or sophomore, it was unbelievable. But guys like Kelby Collins out of Alabama, who's really one of the bigger recruits early on in the Napier era. It just really hasn't caught on to the degree that we were hoping early on, but definitely a guy I think has potential in his career to be a very solid starter anywhere across college football. And then Jakeem Jackson, he's definitely struggled at times. Kid out of Osceola High School there in Central Florida. Very solid athlete, though. I saw him play in a state playoff game at Lakeland a couple years ago, and I thought he was the best player on the field on a receiver that was going to Georgia, and Cormani McClain played that night. So I thought Jackson really shined that night, and was very excited about him becoming a Gator. Obviously, had the injury this year. Uh, wish those guys the best of luck hitting the portal.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting when you talk about a guy like Jakeem Jackson, really what you're talking about is exactly what we talk about from recruiting all the time, right? Is that you stack guys because guys that you look at and say, that guy should be really good. Circumstances, sometimes in his control, sometimes out of his control, just lead to it not working out in a specific spot. And so, Jackson had a profile where we looked at it, and I mean, you sent me the video when you were out there, and I was like, wow, yeah, he looks really, really good. And so I was really excited to see him go out there. Has struggled to stay healthy, has struggled to get on the field, and then honestly has watched guys like Jameer Grimsley, guys like Dijon Johnson, and guys like Cormani McClain jump in front of him on the depth chart. In some ways because of injury, but maybe other things as well. And so again, it's the same thing for Kelby Collins. Like TJ Searcy is getting bulk of the playing time on the outside. They brought in George Gums, who's been very good on the outside as well. So where does he fit, right, within what they're trying to do? And obviously, those guys didn't all commit to Ron Roberts either, right? And so the Roberts Armstrong dynamic, a lot of the position coaches have changed since some of those guys committed as well.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure we necessarily take all that into account either, right? That you don't just commit to Billy Napier, you also commit to the staff. And if the staff has changes, maybe you give it some time, but hey, you don't click with the staff, and that's okay too, because those aren't the guys that you committed to. And you know, you have the right to change your mind, just like Brian Kelly has the right to go from Notre Dame to LSU, and you know, Lincoln Riley has the ability to interview apparently or get contacted by UCF after going from Oklahoma to USC. So,
Not
I,
sure I would listen to a lot of UCF news right now. There's,
I'm
oh,
sorry, not Central Florida, and
yeah,
nah. So, anyway, I don't hold anything against these kids who want to go someplace else and get an opportunity to play. The only time I hold it against them is when they go to Georgia
Georgia,
or something like that.
FSU, Miami.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
we can name a couple.
yeah, there's a few.
We're not perfect. All right. Let's talk about the SEC championship game. Will Texas, Georgia, the Longhorns clinch with a win at Texas A&M. Kyle Field living up to his reputation uh, as the field that is maybe given the most credit and has the least amount of results behind it. The Aggies just could not get off the mat at any point. Texas just beat them up. Saw Arch Manning step in for a little bit of time there at quarterback. They're the favorite going in the game with Georgia, but it's in Atlanta. We saw what Georgia did to Texas early in the season, but Georgia had a lot of plays go their way early on. They had a lot of short field uh, scores and did not play great on offense outside that, but did play great on defense. I think this Texas team is going to be ready for their second shot, but I don't want to see either one of these teams win. This is going to be one of those SEC championship games. Like I could stomach another Alabama, but Texas coming in their first year, you know how much we're going to have to hear about that if they win the SEC in their first year? It's not going to be enjoyable to listen to, and I never want Georgia to win the SEC championship game. So this is just going to be a nice little miserable viewing experience here on Saturday.
Well, way to preview it for for
I'm gonna.
ESPN.
I mean, Florida fans. This is a miserable matchup right
I
here.
mean,
Not
again,
excited.
you and I have been having this debate now for 3 or 4 weeks. I just don't care because one of these teams is going to get a bye, and one of these teams is going to get another playoff game someplace else, and it'll impact how the bracket looks, but it's not going to impact anything beyond that. Maybe there's a little bit of curiosity in terms of can Texas deal with Georgia's pass rush in a way that's different than they did the last time. I think in many ways this is going to be kind of similar to the Florida State game. What was it in '96, right? Where Florida State sort of Spurrier had Werfel under center. Florida State was hitting Werfel late, and then they come back in the Sugar Bowl and just absolutely destroy him after they put him in the shotgun. I suspect Texas will be ready for some of those things. I've been contending for months now that Manning is better than Ewers, and I'm curious to see. Obviously Ewers has some injury concerns as well. I'm really curious to see. This to me is like Kelly Bryant, Trevor Lawrence type thing. Bryant was not a terrible player. Ewers is not a terrible player, but I think Manning gives him a better shot to win the national
You're gonna pull
championship.
the plug Tua style.
I
Put him
mean,
in
I
the
don't
second
know. I don't
half.
know what Sark's going to do, but they have one of the best defenses in the country. Their defense is better than Georgia's. And so this game comes down to Carson Beck versus whoever's playing quarterback for Texas. And Carson Beck has not been great all year
Not what you
long,
want
so
to hear as a
maybe
Georgia fan.
so
Yeah.
maybe you can get the win anyway. But look, I mean, Georgia Tech was running the ball down Georgia's throat, and then when it came time to get a 2 point conversion, decided they were no longer going to run the ball. So that was a little bit annoying, but this is a team that has sort of been on the ropes a few times and has been able to escape. Texas, not so much. I mean, obviously they get the one loss against Georgia, but righted the ship after that and has been able to beat most teams pretty handily since then. And so I think Texas is a better team. I think Texas is going to win the game. So Texas will get the first round bye, and then Georgia will probably end up with like a home game in Athens.
Well, speaking of the playoff bracket here, latest playoff rankings came out. We have Oregon at number one, Texas at two, SMU at three, Boise at four. Those are your first round buys. In the play-in matchup, the teams that play into the number one seeded Oregon Ducks, Ohio State, and Tennessee at the Horseshoe. I watched that Ohio State Michigan game. I have no idea what the Buckeyes were doing. They ran it up the middle into Michigan's defensive tackles. They're by far the strongest part of their defense. They were trying to prove they were tough or something. I don't know what's going on. It's terrible game plan by Ryan Day. I don't think this Buckeye team deserves a home game in their first round there. So they should be headed on the road. So maybe the committee will adjust that at some point. Penn State is set to host Arizona State. Of course, with the Ohio State loss, Penn State jumps into the Big Ten championship game. So they might be one of the teams with the bye coming out of the weekend. So that will be impacted by the
Oh,
weekend.
come on. James Franklin isn't winning that game.
Notre Dame is set to host Alabama at the 11 spot. Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss. Will help me understand the South Carolina conversation because there was a lot of push on Twitter for South Carolina to get into this playoff, and I think the Gamecocks are playing great football right now. They snuck by Clemson. They're very entertaining. But you lost to Alabama. You lost to Ole Miss heads up. I would go Ole Miss out of the three. But Alabama, if you put yourself in a position where you have three losses, I don't feel sorry for you. And especially if you're going to go head to head with Alabama, who do you think the committee is going to choose? It's good to see little old Alabama get a break, but I think I would go Ole Miss out of that bunch. But I'm not sure where the argument for South Carolina is to jump either one of those two.
I mean, you're parsing hairs once you get down to the point where you're talking about these teams. I think Beamer has a point when he talks about the committee chairman coming out and saying, "Well, we're not going to use the data points in these championship games to re-rank anybody, right? Because if Texas goes out and beats Georgia by 50, does that change a perception of people who lost to Texas?
What if a starting
It
quarterback gets injured?
well, that's a question too, right? So I think the committee has done a disservice in terms of they haven't really been clear in terms of how they're going to do these sorts of things. And Beamer also had some choice words about non-conference schedules for some of these teams as well. But Beamer lost games in the SEC. He didn't lose his non-conference games, and other than Clemson, they didn't play anybody in their non-conference schedule.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot of whining from the peanut gallery, from coaches who are just trying to essentially back up their team. And I mean, look, we saw that back in the day when you had the final two. And Urban Meyer wins the SEC championship game and still has to go out there and stump for his team, even though everybody thinks it's pretty obvious they should be playing against Ohio State. And that's all you're doing. It's the same stump speech. It's just now, it's teams that are 8 or 9 and 3 rather than teams that are 11 and 1 arguing over who's going to play for the championship. I don't think any of us. I don't think any of the teams that are 9 and 3 are deserving of a national championship.
Yeah.
Maybe they get hot, right? And maybe what we find out is that 9 and 3 teams can beat these teams any day of the week. I think in many ways the draw is going to matter because it's unclear to me whether Boise and SMU are real or whether they're functions of their conference and functions of their schedule. Same thing with Indiana. It's unclear to me whether they're real. So I can see a scenario where a team like Alabama or a team like Ohio State would go on a run just because everything sets up well for them, which is unfortunate. I wish they would see. I mean, I know why they did it this way, and I know why it's set up this way, but I wish they would seed it just based on ranking. And look, let SMU in the tournament, let whoever else wins the Big 12 into the tournament, let Iowa State or Arizona State in the tournament. That's fine. But they shouldn't have a first round bye. It should be set up to give us the best games.
If Clemson wins, they're getting a first round bye. So keep that in mind. So Clemson team that does not have much to show in terms of victories this year. They will knock SMU back probably to the 11 or 12 spot. Alabama gets booted from the playoffs most likely in that scenario.
Well, and that's actually
That's
going to be
pretty
that's
crazy.
actually going to be the question is if SMU loses by 35 and their quarterback gets injured, do you make an adjustment at that point? Like what is the
That's
because
it's crazy to say you're not going to take the data point from the championship games. Like
yeah,
they're
I
still
mean
games. Yeah,
Well, and everybody signed up to play it, right?
yeah.
And if it's not going to matter, and this has always been my argument, you and I have gone back and forth on this a lot. If it's not going to matter, then why bother? Just don't play the game. Those two teams are in already, just don't play it. And give the ACC championship to whoever has the best, the 17th tiebreaker. Maybe we have to coin flip to figure out who wins it, but just do it like basketball, where the team that I mean now they have the tournaments at the end of the year, but it used to be it was just whoever was 10-1 at the end, or 20-5 or whatever it was at the end of the schedule. Oh, you're the Big Ten champion, you're the ACC champion, and do it that way because why bother playing it? Honestly, I say the same thing about the SEC championship game too. Both of those teams are in. Yeah, you want to hold the trophy up, but if they awarded the trophy based on your record at the end of the year and said Texas, you've got the best record in the SEC, you're the SEC champion, does anyone really get upset? The reason these games exist is because they make money for the different conferences, so they don't want to get rid of them. The problem is that the way they've set up the system is these games have negative incentives. If in fact the games can knock someone out, they also have negative incentives from an injury perspective. And so, I don't think the howling is going to come from a team that loses one of these games and gets left out. I think the howling eventually will come when someone suffers an injury in one of these games. Because look, it's big boy football. People get injured. Like if DJ Lagway was in one of these games and the hamstring injury happened in this one, yeah, maybe he can get recovered by December 20th, but you don't necessarily know that. And so I'm curious to see how this works. And
Hey, let Georgia
there
lose
you
by
go.
3 touchdowns to Texas, have a third loss on the season, and get in ahead of Alabama and Ole Miss, two of the teams that beat them.
Yeah.
That's going to be a
Well,
hilarious scenario. But again, at at some point, this is the first year. My brain's not totally wrapped around the fact that teams with 3 losses have a shot at the national title still. So I don't feel bad for you. If you're in a spot with three, yeah, you're going to leave it up to the committee. That's your problem. I don't
well,
really
that's the
feel
thing.
bad
Ole
for
Miss
anyone.
lost to Kentucky, guys.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it used to be if you lost to Kentucky, you
Your
were just
season's
out.
over. Right.
But you could say the same thing about Notre Dame, right? They lose to Northern Illinois. It used to be
Right.
you lose to
Right.
Northern Illinois, you're out. And this has been my contention all year long is that Northern Illinois game was exciting for me. And this is actually where my entire like apathy towards the playoff came from is I watched that Northern Illinois game. I've got a bunch of friends who are Notre Dame fans that I really enjoy giving crap when the Irish are terrible. They lose that game. Freeman has always lost one of those games in every season that he's been here. And they just coast basically the rest of the way. I mean, hey, they beat Navy, they beat Army, they beat a USC team that's not very good. They're the Notre Dame for years has been put in different playoffs that they didn't earn because their schedule has been crap for years. And now we're even making it easier for them, and that annoys me. So I'm going to be the old man yelling at the cloud until this thing's over, and then when the playoffs are going on, I'm going to be the guy who's like
Well,
raptured and
you
watching
should
it. So
love this weekend because now all those the stakes are very real this weekend. You look at a team like Boise State. If they don't win, they're not in the play. They're not going to the playoff. Arizona State and Iowa State have a shot to get in. You have Clemson on the outside with a shot to get in. I mean, there's all types of stuff. There's all types
see
of
though, but
pieces that can
that
move
actually
still.
probably would have been something I would have supported if they would have said, you know what we're going to do is we're going to take six conferences, the top two get buys, and it's going to be a six-team tournament, and you have to win your conference to get into this tournament. And they just said that you have to win your conference. Screw you, Notre Dame. Join a conference, or you don't get to play in this thing. And they just did it that way. And then you set it up to where the SEC championship getting into that game is critical. And yeah, you can lose a game or two in a non-conference setting or something like that. So hey, you can challenge yourself in non-conference settings, and maybe the rankings have something to do with like seeding or something like that. So you're incentivized to open with Clemson like Georgia did, or open with Miami like Florida did. But the goal to me is to make the conference championship mean something. And so, yeah, the Boise State conference championship means something. The Iowa State Arizona State game means something. Those are the games I'm going to pay attention to. The SEC championship game will pay attention to because I'm a college football fan. But I don't know that that's going to like rapture people who are involved. Now, look, the minute it's single elimination and you're done, people will watch and I will watch. And so I get it and I understand and it's new and you know, I didn't like the pitch clock when it got brought into Major League Baseball. And then I went to one game and I went, why didn't they bring this in 35 years ago? So, you know, I've been wrong before. Maybe I'll be wrong again, and we'll see what happens when the playoff comes.
I want to make a bold prediction for this weekend. Miami, as Mario called them, the best program in this state, best program in this state will not win the ACC again. They will not do it. Uh, they- love seeing them on the outside of the playoff after that loss to Syracuse. It's been fun. It's been fun watching them squirm over this
Well,
one,
I like that there was actually a consequence for losing to Syracuse, right? Like as I'm watching that
which
game,
may
I
have been
watched
one of the
that game.
better teams on their schedule. Will the 9-3 Syracuse Orange with Kyle McCord tossing the ball all over the park?
Yeah, but this is the thing is that they have been escaping teams all
Right.
year long. And finally they got caught against Georgia Tech and finally they got caught against Syracuse. And those are the kinds of teams that are going to get absolutely slaughtered when they play a better team in the playoff. And so I'm fine with Boise State replacing them. I'm fine with SMU replacing them. I'm fine with, you know, Indiana replacing them, right? The thing I'm not real keen on is the Alabama replacing them because I think Alabama getting absolutely demolished by Oklahoma ain't that much better than Miami losing to
It's
Syracuse. And
significantly
so,
worse.
yeah,
That loss should carry a little more weight, but I'm not going to cry about it. I'm not going to cry about it for
well,
Miami. Enjoy it.
I'm not either. Screw them.
Yeah. All right. Long episode here. Lot to cover on National Signing Day. Still some work to do. I think there's some guys out there that didn't sign that are still on the table there for the Gators, and the portal will be opening soon. I also saw the SEC will be announcing the 2025 schedule next week, so maybe we'll have that for you on next week's show. In the meantime, everybody enjoy conference championship weekend, and we'll get that final playoff field on Sunday, Will. So everybody have a great weekend and go Gators.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to Stand Up and Holler. If you're interested in more information from me and Nick, you can go over to readandreaction.com. You can like and subscribe our YouTube channel here at Read and Reaction, or you can go to patreon.com/readandreaction to support us, get extra information, and we do Ask Anythings over there every once in a while as well. So check us out. Thanks for listening.